that you didn't know them at all? Maybe it was someone you thought was your friend, and then they betrayed you. Is this on? Okay.
Barely here.
Maybe it was someone that you thought was your friend, and then they betrayed you or did something that hurt you really badly. Or maybe it was somebody that you thought didn't like you at all. They weren't friendly, they were cold, and then somehow you got to know them and you discovered that they weren't like that at all. They were just shy. They really were very kind, and they liked you a lot. How well do you know Jesus? Jesus is the most famous person in all history, of course. I'd like to suggest that Jesus is also probably the most misunderstood person in all history. So today, let's take a look at Jesus. We're going to look at him through somebody else's eyes. John, Jesus' best friend, Jesus' cousin, one of Jesus' first disciples, one of the inner three, one of the 12 apostles who wrote the biography in our New Testament that we call the Gospel of John. Let's look at Jesus through John's eyes. And I think we'll discover that Jesus was the most likable, most inviting person who ever lived. But not everyone thought that. Not then, not now. Some people don't like Jesus. They even hate him because they don't know who he really is. Or maybe they do know who he is, and that knowing him really means they got to change some things in their life, and they don't want to change. But even people who say they love Jesus sometimes don't really know him. Sometimes they've created a fantasy Jesus who isn't the real Jesus. So let's look at him through John's eyes. How many of you have somebody that you might call your best friend, or have had somebody like that? All right. How many of you have a cousin that you really like? All right. How about giving me a few names? Just toss out the first name of a best friend or a cousin. I'm sorry? Tom. Mark. Tanya? All right. Shelley. All right. Hey, lots of them, right? Let me ask you a question. What would it take for you to believe that person you just named, what would it take for you to believe that they were really God in a human body? The creator of the universe, who, after living for all eternity in heaven as God, came down to earth and took on the body of your best friend, your cousin. What would it take for you to believe that? Kelly, you laughed. No way, right? No way. I mean, I love my cousin Brian, but God in a human body? Wouldn't be. Do you understand? That's exactly what happened to John. He grew up with Jesus. They probably played softball together, or something. I mean, he was his cousin after all. But he came to the point of believing, if you look at the opening verses of his biography of Jesus, he came to believe that Jesus was forever God, the creator of all things, and John left everything to spend the rest of his life telling people about his best friend, his cousin, who was really God. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Wow. Well, John chapter 2 includes two stories that show a very different Jesus. The first story is at a wedding reception, and there we see Jesus as a fun-loving, party-going, wine-drinking, miracle-working, superhero party saver. It's the happy Jesus. But the second story reveals Jesus as an angry, ticked-off, scary, furniture-tossing, violent bouncer who made a whip and drove people out of the temple. Wow, that's the angry Jesus. They're both Jesus. And we're going to look at those stories today. The first one shows the Jesus that everybody loves. The second story shows a Jesus that some of the people there hated so much that they actually got him crucified a little later. All right, first let's look at Jesus' attractiveness. Jesus was very attractive. I'm not talking about his physical appearance, because the prophet Isaiah told us that when the Messiah, Jesus, came, well, here's what Isaiah said. He will have no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Jesus wasn't good looking. He wasn't handsome. Nobody looked at Jesus and took a second look because, wow, that guy is good looking. Never happened. He was not the rugged, Hollywood, handsome, white guy that many people think of as Jesus. That's a fantasy Jesus. You know what? When I look for pictures of Jesus online to put in a slide like this, it's very hard to not find a Western-looking, white, ruggedly handsome guy wearing a bathrobe. But Jesus wasn't good looking. You know why I really like that? Because I'm not very good looking. And at least in that one way, I'm kind of like Jesus. Won't point at anybody, but maybe there's some other people like that here too. But Jesus was very attractive. He was very likable. Why do I say that? Well, in this story, it begins with an invitation. Jesus was invited to somebody's wedding, along with his mother and his first new disciples, Andrew, John, Peter, Philip, and Nathaniel. Well, who do you invite to your wedding? People you like, right? Oh, I know, there's that aunt that you got to invite because she's your relative, but you really would not want her there if you could help it, right? We invite people to our wedding that we really like. And listen to John chapter 2, verse 1. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. You see, Jesus was the kind of person that you invited to your wedding, to your party. You invited him to dinner at your house. Jesus was the kind of person that you'd want to watch the Lions game with. Jesus is the kind of person that you introduced to your friend. You brought your children to him so he could bless them. You wanted to be around Jesus. He was attractive. He was likable. But wait a minute. Jesus was just starting his public ministry. I mean, there's a lot people didn't know about him, right? Did you know that even from his childhood, Jesus was likable? Luke 2:52. Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. Even as a child, people looked on him favorably. And then there was that incident at the temple. Remember when he was 12 years old? What a crazy story. But here, for 3 days, he captivated, he intrigued the biblical scholars of that day because there was something about Jesus that was just special, that set him apart. And then we come to the 4 biographies where we learn about his life during that 3-year ministry, and we discover that he treated people with respect and kindness. Don't you like that about somebody? He truly cared about people and their problems. He was approachable. He was compassionate. Even when people really messed up, and he didn't condemn them, he just loved them. People opened up to him. They wanted to tell him their problems. They wanted to tell him their secrets. He was always honest. He told it like it was, but never was unkind or judgmental. He made people feel like they were important, like they had value. People brought their friends to meet him because they thought he'd help them with their problems. He brought their kids. Jesus was fun to be with. Jesus accepted and he hung out with people that everybody else looked down on. The marginalized, the poor, the neglected, the discounted, the handicapped, the objects of prejudice, the under-resourced. That's who Jesus hung out with. And that made him very attractive. He was the kind of person that you wanted to invite to your house for dinner. If he was here this morning, you'd say, stay and eat fish with us. Or a different Sunday, you'd say, want to go out for lunch today after church? I mean, that's who Jesus was. By the way, isn't that how Christians should be? Christ ones? And a church is a place where Christians hang out, right? So isn't that what a church ought to be like? I mean, Christians and churches ought to be the kindest, most welcoming place in the county, right? We don't always have that reputation, though, do we? I mean, sometimes Christians have the reputation of being people who aren't very kind, people who are judgmental and closed-minded, people who think they know everything, you know? People who sometimes are considered to be racist or homophobic or anti-trans or anti-immigrants or anti-this or anti-that or anti-the other. It's no wonder that some people, you know some, who've gotten cynical and walked away from church because they thought that's what Jesus was like by looking at some Christians. It's a Baptist church in Muskegon. One of my friends pastored it for many years. And I learned that down the block from the church, one of his deacons lived. And one of the other people who lived in the block said that that man is the meanest guy on the block. Whoa. Wouldn't it be great if the people who lived on our block said of us, they're the nicest people we know? Shouldn't it be like that? Now, I understand when people get cynical because sometimes I feel that way too. Not here, by the way. But then I have to be reminded that Jesus had 12 disciples and one of them was a mess. Remember? And I have to remember that of the 28 letters in the New Testament, all but one talk about the problems they had in the church. So we shouldn't be shocked when we're not everything we're supposed to be, but we should make sure that's not how we are. We should be like Jesus. Well, partway through the wedding, and Jewish weddings back then sometimes went for days, partway through the reception, a huge problem came up. What was it? They ran out of wine. Oh my goodness. That was horrible. It was a huge problem. It was an absolute nightmare. It was about to turn what should have been the best day in the lives of the bride and groom into the worst day of their lives. It would be a terrible social embarrassment. I mean, the parents who put on the wedding reception would never live it down. It was awful. Somebody told Mary, Jesus' mother, and Mary told Jesus. On the third day the wedding took place. Jesus' mother was there and Jesus and his disciples. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Dear woman, Jesus said, why do you involve me? My time has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. My son David is a pastor. By the way, this is his last Sunday at the church where he's been for 13 years. And then he's moving to Oregon, where his kids live, and pastored a church there. But anyway, David preached on this passage one Sunday, and here was the title. What do you do when the wine runs out? Isn't that a great title? I mean, you could fill it in with something other than wine, right? What do you do when the money runs out? What do you do when your friends run out? What do you do when your health runs out? Great question. But Mary did something that hopefully all of us are learning to do. Tell it to Jesus. You know, that ought to be my first instinct when something runs out, when there's a problem. Tell it to Jesus. Now think about this. Jesus had not worked a single miracle yet. Not one. Mary had no idea what he was going to do. But she knew what he was like. She knew he cared about people. She knew he'd try to do something to solve the problem. And I think by this time she understood very much who her son was and what he was capable of. Jesus responded to her, dear woman, why do you involve me? That sounds maybe a little bit abrupt, but one translation adds that word, dear woman, because the same Greek word can mean an endearing term. But it might have been that Jesus was giving her a gentle reminder, hey, Mom, I'm 30. And I'm on a mission, and it's not my mother's mission now, it's my Father in heaven's mission. But Mary was not offended by that. She didn't understand that he wasn't going to do anything, because what did she do? She immediately turned to the servants who were there, and she said to them, do whatever he tells you. Isn't that a great line? Do whatever he tells you. Why don't you turn to somebody close to you and say, do whatever he tells you. Thank you for all of you who participated in that little exercise. Do whatever Jesus tells you. Now, having looked at Jesus' attractiveness, let's take another look. Let's look at Jesus' ability. Gloria and I were at a wedding reception a number of years ago. We'd gone to the wedding first and then to another building where the reception was. And the baker had written down the wrong date on her calendar, so there was no wedding cake. Now, lots of weddings, there would still be a big meal, or maybe even a simple sandwiches and chips. But this was a wedding where the only thing they had, or were supposed to have, was wedding cake and punch. By the way, the bride was absolutely amazing. I could hardly believe it. She just took it in stride. That's okay. But Gloria turned to me and she said, "Bill, do something." What do I do? Turn water into wedding cake? But if you know Gloria, when she says, "Bill," I'm listening. So I ran outside, jumped in the car, drove a few blocks down the road to Meijer, ran in, and the bakery was closed. But they were still there cleaning up. And I said, "Ladies, you got to help me." I bought every sheet cake in the bakery that didn't say happy birthday. Well, that was the best I could do, but Jesus had the ability to do something far better. Remember? Nearby stood 6 stone jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. These are big jars, big pots. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill them with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he said, "Now draw some out, take the water to the master of the banquet." They did it. The master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine, didn't realize where it had come from. The servants did. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everybody brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests are soused, and they won't even be able to tell the difference." That's kind of right out there, isn't it? But he said, "You saved the best wine till last." Jesus' instructions were pretty strange. He said, "Go fill those water pots with water." Oh, so what was he going to do? Say, forget the wine, give everybody a glass of water? But they did it. No small job. Those 6 pots would hold somewhere around 150 gallons of water. Oh my goodness. Can you imagine taking 150 gallons of water or milk out of Meijer and loading it in your car? 150 gallons? Get the picture of what's going on here. By the way, water, a gallon of water weighs about 8.33 pounds, which means this was around 1,250 pounds of water. And when they were done, Jesus said, "Okay, take some to the MC." I love this picture. When the MC got that glass of wine, I think he first, swirled it around a little bit. And then he closed his eyes and he sniffed it. And then he took a little sip and he kind of rolled it around his tongue and savored it. And then a big smile spread over his face and he said, "What is this? Everybody does the expensive wine first and then the cheap wine when they can't tell the difference. But you saved the best till now." Can I make 3 observations on this particular miracle of Jesus' ability? The first one is, Jesus is the great problem solver. Jesus is the great problem solver. He saved the wedding. He rescued the families from embarrassment. He re-energized the party. Now, I'm not suggesting that Jesus is like a genie. You rub the lamp and out pops Jesus and he says, "What do you want me to do?" Jesus isn't a miracle vending machine. Put in a quarter or a little prayer and out pops the miracle. It's not how it always works, is it? Now, I can tell you, Jesus has done some wonderful, amazing, supernatural things for me. And many of you could say the same thing. But you know what? He hasn't promised to pay every bill that I have. He hasn't promised to take away every illness. He hasn't promised to repair every relationship that's gone sour. And even when he does those things, he doesn't always do it on my timetable. Doesn't always do it in the way I wanted him to. It's a bit of a mystery to me why sometimes Jesus answers my prayer just like that. Wow, amazing. And sometimes it's like he lost my phone number. And he doesn't answer me in 3 hours or 3 days or 3 years. And that's when I have to remember that He's God and I'm not. What did I just say? Yeah. And I'm slowly learning that when He doesn't do it my way, my timetable, it's because He knows what's best for me. I may not even always see that in this life, but He's God, and He always does what's best. But the point is, there's no problem beyond Jesus' ability to do it. He's the great problem solver. Here's another observation. Jesus enjoyed life, including partying and drinking wine with other people. Now, if you think that Jesus was some rigid, stuffed shirt killjoy who never laughed, who just did boring religious things, you've got the wrong Jesus. That's a fantasy Jesus. Jesus took a lot of criticism because of the people He hung out with sometimes, remember? People had a really bad reputation for the things they did or didn't do. People that everybody else looked down on. Jesus hung out with them. And have you thought about how many of Jesus' stories, we call them parables, how many of them happened at a dinner party where there was food and wine and dancing? I mean, Jesus enjoyed life with His friends. And here's one other observation. Jesus' miracle was a sign. Verse 11 says this, the first of His miraculous signs, there are 6 more big ones in the Gospel of John. This was the first of His miraculous signs Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. He thus revealed His glory. The miracle was a sign. What are signs? Well, signs give us information, right? Stop. Speed limit, 45. The Mackinac Bridge, 12 miles. Man, I like that sign. I'm almost home. Well, old home. This is a good one. Restaurants, bathrooms, exit 33, right? Signs give you information. They point to something. Now, all of Jesus' miracles were signs. They were signs that told people who He is and what His future kingdom will be like. First of all, His signs pointed at who He was. He's God in human flesh. He did things that only God could do, things for which there was no logical or scientific explanation. His miracles were signs that said, hey, everybody, this is God. But His miracles were also signs about what, when He comes back, what His future kingdom on earth is going to be like. Think about this miracle. Think about the miracle when He took a little boy's lunch and fed 5,000 men plus women and children. You know what? It was a sign that in Jesus' future kingdom there will be plenty of food, plenty of drink for everybody. Do you remember the miracle when Jesus, or the miracles I should say, when He healed all kinds of sickness, all kinds of illness? You see, those were signs that in His future kingdom there'll be no sickness. Everybody will be healthy. And then remember the times when Jesus raised somebody from the dead. His friend Lazarus, the widow's son, the synagogue leader's little girl. Because in Jesus' future kingdom on earth, there will be no more death. Wow. And then, remember the story about the storm? I mean, the disciples were going to cross the Sea of Galilee, and suddenly a huge storm came up. And these guys, many of whom were seasoned fishermen, were so terrified they thought they were going to die. And they said, Jesus, who was sleeping in the front of the boat, wake up! We're going to die! And Jesus stood up in the front of the boat and He looked at the storm. And you can see the wind whipping, and Jesus says, shh, peace, be still. And just like that, the storm stopped. Because in Jesus' future kingdom, it's a sign, there will be no more storms, no more climatic tragedies. And remember that many of Jesus' miracles was casting out demons. It was a sign that in His future kingdom, Satan and all of his demons and their temptation and their lies will be gone forever. His miracles were signs, who He is and what His future kingdom will be like. By the way, no wonder Jesus made so much wine. No wedding on earth could consume 150 gallons of wine. That's 2,400 glasses of wine. What do you think they did with the extra? I'm guessing that maybe they sold some to give the newlyweds a good head start on life. Maybe some for the parents to sell to pay for the reception. I mean, maybe they were poor and that's why they ran out of wine. I'm guessing that they took some and distributed to the poor so they could have a nice dinner with wine, the best wine that they couldn't afford. But you see, in Jesus' kingdom, people aren't going to just get by. They're not going to just survive. In Jesus' future kingdom, people are going to thrive. They're going to flourish. They're going to have more than enough. We call this book the Gospel of John. What does the word gospel mean? Good news. For a long time in my life, I thought the good news was that you believe in Jesus, when you die, you go to heaven. And it is. That's incredibly good news, but it's only part of it. There's so much good news about Jesus, like what his future kingdom on earth will be like. Great news. Well, what about the other story? What about the angry, ticked-off, scary, violent bouncer enforcer Jesus? The one who got so angry that he tipped over a bunch of tables and made a whip and drove the money changers out of the temple. I mean, that's not really very kind, is it? I mean, that's not very nice. Well, for the annual Passover feast, and that's when this was, as many as 2.25 million, mostly Jews, came from all over that part of the world to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast. And the focal point of the Passover was the magnificent temple complex in Jerusalem. And people would bring their money and their animal and bird offerings to give to God at the Passover feast. But over the years, the selfish, greedy, powerful temple bosses had made up some new rules. Self-serving, oppressive rules. Like no one could use any foreign money. And everybody had to have an animal that was without blemish. Can you guess what I'm holding in my hand? The quarter. Whose picture is on it? George Washington. You know what that tells you, among other things? This is an American coin, right? Not Mexican or Spanish or German. It's American. George Washington. Do you remember when they came to Jesus and said, should we pay taxes? And he said, show me a coin. And somebody pulled out a coin and Jesus said, whose picture is it? Caesar. All the money they had was foreign money. The Romans were the invaders. They were in charge. They hated the Romans. But that's the only money they had. So when they came to make their offerings, the only money they had was foreign money. They'd walk in and there was a big table for the money changers, and they said, sorry, you can't use that money here. But tell you what, give it to us and we'll give you some temple money. And guess who made a big profit on that? And you had to have animals, birds, that were without blemish, perfect. And so they had searched their flocks, they'd searched through their birds, and they brought the best they had. And when they walked in, there was a big table that had a sign over it that said, animals and birds inspected here. And guess what? They looked at your animal and they said, sorry, that one's not good enough. But tell you what, you probably don't want to have to take that animal back home, 60-mile walk. Why don't you just leave the animal here and buy one of these temple animals? You see what's going on? This was horrific. These selfish, greedy temple bosses were making all kinds of money, oppressing the people who could not afford it. You know what made it really bad? It was all practiced in the name of God and worship. You know where it happened? The big temple complex. When you first walked into the complex, you entered a big open area called the Court of the Gentiles. Because the only part of the temple complex that a non-Jew, a Gentile, could come into was there, the big courts. That's where this happened. And so there with all the money changers and the animal exchange, the Gentiles who had come because they'd heard of the God of Israel and wanted to learn about Him, that's what they saw. Do you think that made them want to serve and worship the God of Israel? Or do you think it turned them off? Wow. What kind of impression do you think it makes on people today if they see corruption among Christian leaders? Almost every pastor I know, almost every one of them, are men and women of integrity. They're not making a fortune in the ministry. But you know, and I know, that there are some of these big celebrity pastors, these TV evangelists, they're raking it in. Send me some money and God will give you a miracle. The genie approach, You think that turns people away? I get a daily email. It's called the oh my goodness, mental block. Anyway, this is an investigative reporting place that investigates corrupt Christian leaders. Every day, they report on typically 2 more pastors or Christian leaders who have abused girls, who've had affairs, who've cheated the church out of money. You know what that does to people when they see that? Oh my goodness. I told you, I know hundreds, maybe thousands of pastors. And I could count on one hand and have fingers left over the ones that are like that, because that's not what most of them are like. But when they are, it's like the court of the Gentiles and this horrible stuff going on. So Jesus made a whip out of cords, drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" I can hear somebody saying, "Well, that wasn't very kind. That wasn't very nice. What happened to the gentle Jesus? The happy Jesus?" Sometimes when I've tried to call out corruption, whether it's in the church or in politics, I have Christian friends who say to me, "Pastor, I thought you were loving. How can you say those things?" You know what? Sometimes being nice isn't nice. These people in the temple courts were oppressing the poor. They were hypocrites and thieves. They turned religion into a business for their personal enrichment. They were bullies, selfish. They distorted who God was and what it means to worship Him, exposing their hypocrisy, disrupting their oppression, ending their robbery, bringing them to justice was the nicest, kindest thing that Jesus could possibly have done. It's not nice or loving to stand by while rich and powerful people enrich themselves at the expense of those who have too little. A truly inviting person who is like Jesus gets angry at the right people, stands up to bullies, condemns hypocrites, and does their part to bring evildoers to justice. Do you know, throughout His ministry, check me out, Jesus' harshest words weren't for people who were struggling with some sin. He loved them. Jesus' harshest words were for people in power who were using their power to enrich themselves and oppress others. Check me out on that. His anger and condemnation were focused on religious and political leaders who made up man-made laws, oppressed people, and took away from the simple, beautiful story of Jesus, who said, "Love your neighbor as yourself, and even love your enemies." Wow. I'll guarantee that the average person there in the temple courts that day started to cheer. Yay! Get him, Jesus! At last! This is Jesus' anger. Well, quickly, let's head for the finish line. There's a picture of Jesus' anticipation. Unsurprisingly, the rich and powerful people that day that Jesus chased away were not very happy. So let's look at Jesus' anticipation here. The Jews demanded of him, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove that you have authority to do this?" And Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and after 3 days I will raise it up." They said, "It took 40 years to build this temple. You're going to restore it in 3 days?" But Jesus was not talking about that temple. He was talking about the temple of his body, which when they destroyed his body on the cross, 3 days later, he promised he would rise from the dead. By the way, that is the greatest sign of all. Jesus said, "Kill me, I'll die for the sins of the world, and after 3 days, I will rise from the dead." Jesus' resurrection changes everything. Jesus' resurrection changes everything. It proves that he was God. It proves that God accepted his sacrifice for the sins of the world, all of my sins. It proves that we're going to rise from the dead just like he did. He promised. It proves that he's going to have a kingdom on earth where everything is the way it should be. Evil will be punished, good rewarded, forgiveness and eternal life will be ours forever. Everything sin broke is someday going to be repaired. All things will be made new. Look at Jesus. Look at Jesus. Bring your problems, your sins, your struggles, your doubts, your fears, the mysteries, the burdens, bring them to Jesus. Bring them to Jesus. Don't just come to him, run to him. And remember, whatever he says to you, do it. Oh, Lord Jesus, thank you so much for who you are, for this wonderful story. Jesus, I want to be like you. Help me, help me. Thank you for this church and these welcoming people. I'm so grateful for them and how they model so much of what I've talked about. Bless this church. Keep them red hot with their love for people. In our neighborhoods, Lord, help us to have a reputation like Jesus. Thank you for the wonderful promises. We hang on to them with all of our might. Help us to follow you no matter what. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Remember, we're not going to have that closing song, so would you like to stand with me and let me just remind you? I'm sorry.